Hello, and welcome to Leaderfolk, an inclusive look inside the Jewish community. I'm your host, Sara. Today, I'm joined by Rabbi Jessy Dressin. She is the executive director of Repair the World Baltimore and is the rabbi on staff for the organization nationally. She does a lot of other amazing things and has some incredible thoughts to share. And Rabbi Jessy, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yes, me too. So I'd love to start off, please, by just having you introduce yourself, explain where you come from, what's your journey to the point where you are today.
Well, my DNA is 50% Brooklyn and 50% Queens, and I grew up in Virginia, where my extent of Judaism in the earliest stages was my mother kind of raising issue with the local public school administration when a mitten tree would show up in the school lobby in December, which was not a Christmas tree, but it was a evergreen tree that we would put mittens and hats on to be donated. And the administration would turn around and say, well, it's not a Christmas tree, but you can come in and teach about Hanukkah. But I'm the child of two parents who didn't have formal Jewish education necessarily, but grew up in very culturally rich and familial Jewish settings. And so I started off with a deep sense of cultural Jewish identity and ultimately fell in love with the Torah and the tradition. And now I'm a rabbi. So a lot happened between then and now, but I think that's where I come from. And it lands me currently in my 8th year living in Baltimore, Maryland, working as a community rabbi, and for the last year working as the executive director of Repair the World in Baltimore.
Amazing. Let's talk a little bit more about your work with Repair the World. Have you only been there the 1 year?
Well, technically, I've only been there the 1 year, although I have been intimately connected to Repair the World from the very beginning. Repair celebrated its 10th anniversary just a year ago in October, and I was in rabbinical school when Repair the World kind of emerged as a concept in the field of service learning, mostly with the focus of capacity building at the time. And they were searching for their first program director. And one of my friends, who's a colleague, considered throwing her name in the hat for it. So I've known Repair since the beginning. I came to Baltimore in 2012 and did work for 7 years as a community rabbi. And Repair the World came to Baltimore in 2013. And so in my previous work, I worked very closely with Repair, and I have done a lot of work with Repair, both locally and nationally. But technically, I've only been on staff for a year.
Got it. So what has that year been like for you?
Well, I have woken up grateful every day that the work I am being charged to do is to start from a place of Jewish wisdom and Jewish values and then go out into the world beyond the Jewish world alone to apply them in ways that help to try and engage folks in meaningful service and building relationships across lines of difference that will allow us to have an impact in areas of food insecurity and education disparity, and to really figure out what it means to be a Jewish organization that works with a lens of racial equity. And it's challenging and it's awesome. And every day I feel like I'm doing important work and feel really grateful for the people that make up my network of what it means to be a rabbi in the community and have days where I don't learn from anyone who's Jewish, and yet I learn so much more than I knew when I woke up that morning.
What does it mean to you to be in that position as executive director, and also like to have the rabbinic training under your belt?
So I decided that I wanted to go into Jewish education my senior year of high school. I had come home. I grew up 10 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. And I went home after a weekend with my youth group of learning what Judaism had to say about certain legislative and social justice issues of our day. And I went to my civics teacher and I said, why don't we do this? I learned more in that weekend than I might have in an entire year of my civics class. And my teacher told me, that what I had participated in was considered value education, and that in the public school system I was being raised in, we weren't allowed to do that. And I decided right there I was going into Jewish education. And for me, I learned that life and the totality of life's experiences was the classroom for learning in the realm of Jewish education. So I share that because I feel that to be completely true today. I think that our particular faith tradition calls us to interact more broadly in the world than just with people like us. And working as a rabbi, working as the leader of a Jewish organization in Baltimore that some might see as being on the periphery of Jewish life, actually stands adjacent to the kinds of partners and movement leaders and efforts that are happening in so many different particular segments of community. And I get to kind of bring the best of what Judaism and Jewish community has to offer in those intersectional spaces. And I also get to bring all the learning that's happening in those places that can only happen where people of different backgrounds meet back into Jewish spaces and into conversations where people are looking to make more connections between the two.
Are there one or two specific instances of this intersectionality that you'd like to kind of highlight or zoom in on?
Sure. I think Baltimore is a hyper-segregated city. And, Judaism teaches us that in order to move forward, we have to consider our past. That's the essence of why we come around the table for Passover Seders every year. And this act of looking back in order to move forward. Because of the deep presence of Jewish community and Jewish people in Baltimore for hundreds of years, and the fact that Baltimore City itself is a mostly Black city, there are a lot of opportunities for us to look back and to probe the ways that different communities have intersected with one another in order to also look forward. And for me, when I think about the work that we do in different neighborhoods in Baltimore and the way that we approach our work, which is to engage in service that kind of values mutual aid and hopefully deepens relationships between all parties involved, not just, creates this dynamic of one group coming to help another, that we learn stories, and often we hear anecdotes from people who we may not have otherwise met, who have thought about what it means to be a part of the Jewish people that is maybe true, it's maybe not, but it's usually formed from a distance. And so those experiences of being together in a local garden and weeding a tomato bed, but also talking about the histories of our people in a moment of now and potential for where we could go together in relationship. It happens in so many different places and settings, but it's consistent in the work that we do. The other thing I would think about is that right now, trying to disrupt the binary of talking about communities, for example, like the Jewish community and the Black community, we have an incredible, growing community of Jews of color, and the opportunity for their leadership in a city that has a great presence of Jewish influence and Black cultural influence it's hard to explain what its potential power is for, but it's very clear that in these moments, we are trying to discover what we can do together that also is inviting us to think about where our connection points and maybe some of our barriers to connection have been in the past.
Considering that you and your organization were already so deeply entrenched in this work, what was the fallout in the wake of George Floyd and the revitalized energy with the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer? How has that changed your work, changed trajectory, infused new directions to go?
I'm so glad you asked that, Sara, and I'm going to give you two quick answers. The first is maybe a little less rabbinic than the second, but it's important. if I'm being honest, in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, I couldn't stop thinking about how angry I was because 5 years earlier here in Baltimore, Freddie Gray died. And in terms of our local points of awakening for this summer, I was often also navigating a sort of righteous indignation or just indignation. I'm not sure that we were just now kind of in theory waking up to something that I'm like, wait a minute, I was in Sandtown the day after the uprisings took place and saw the destruction and saw the community and saw the power of folks coming together. And then it's like, 5 years later, here we are all over again. And so I felt a lot of anger and yet at the same time, a commitment to think about, okay, so Manish Tana, how will this be different? As an organization, you said that's already so entrenched in this work and does this work. I think that we spent a lot of time critiquing how we will deepen our commitments and how we will work really more intentionally to strengthen our platform, because it's not enough for us to say, well, we do this work pretty well. In fact, the more you do this work, the more potential for harm you have when you run up on a blind spot. So Repair as an organization has deepened its commitments to its racial justice work. We brought on a senior advisor of racial equity that's working with all facets of the organization. I handle a lot of the curriculum work alongside of some of my other colleagues for the organization in a variety of programs that we do. And I'm working with this advisor to also think about our curriculum, both the work that we do internally in our organization and especially what faces outward and externally that we're doing that work. We built a local board during this time. We did some racial equity work with some great local facilitators in order to get them started. And I think, it doesn't really matter where you're at in this work because there's always more work to do. And so taking accounting of what we do well and really being honest about where we need to do better and doing that work at both the local and the national level has been a part of daily life since George Floyd's death.
And as the rabbi for Repair the World on a national level, what does that look like? Does that include counseling people who do this work on, how to take care of themselves for the long haul of really committing to the advocacy and the activism?
Yeah, I think it's all of that. Well, first of all, as the rabbi, you have great partners who, when you run up on your own blind spot, whether it's in a Zoom meeting or it's in a teaching session, will privately chat you and be like, hey, just a heads up, you hit this blind spot, and you'll be like, thanks for looking out for me, and then try and reconcile it in the exact same moment where you commit to not doing it that way in the future, which I'm really grateful for those people. But, it's so important that those of us who have these titles that give us sometimes this unearned or at least invited power, we need that if we're going to use it for good and sacred purposes. We're really in service to people, but sometimes these titles put us in distinction to people. So that's one thing. The other thing I think about is, this work that we're doing, and one of the reasons I've loved working on behalf of the Jewish people and Jewish tradition for my career is because it's not just a cerebral intellectual exercise. It's a matter of the heart, and it's a matter of the soul, and it's a matter of the spirit. And for me, I feel like my work as a rabbi is to continually invite the expansive understanding of the work we do as being otherworldly and having the potential to impact not just the physical things we're working on, but the realms that are kind of intangible and we can't see. And so I, do a little bit of creating opportunities for ritual and reflection. And, I am somebody that folks know believes that there's Torah for everything. It's one of my working hypotheses. And so for me, I think the work I'm most proud of as a rabbi for the organization is to have the access to the wealth of Jewish literature and tradition and be able to show how ongoing certain values are that become like increasingly resonant in the moment. So one of the gifts that I can bring is that I can bring a text from the Talmud, which was comprised sometime in the 4th, 5th, or 6th century, about the obligation that a person has to protest wrongdoing in their community, and I can present it in the summer of 2020 and say, look, there's Torah for this. It strengthens your platform and hopefully deepens your sense of identity for what our tradition can, give folks who are looking to grasp on to things they can use in the world they're living in.
What does it mean to you to be helping to shape a new generation of Jewish activists or Jewish thinkers or just Jewish people who live in a broader world and intersect with all different populations all the time?
There's a term in Hebrew that I have not yet found a good way to say in English. It sounds a little hokey whenever I try to translate it. And the Hebrew is bruchati, like baruch, like blessing. It's my blessing. That would be the direct translation. But then, I might lean into my hippie nature and character if people don't realize the richness of that baruch. Sometimes I'll say it's my honor, but it really is. I mean, I hope it doesn't sound ridiculous, but I do feel like I have been called to do this work and to be of service to the Jewish people and to the world beyond through my Jewish values lens. That feels like it is very much in service of trying to make the world a more whole and just place. And I think that generational shifting is a part of the legacy that we were promised way back in the desert and in the Torah. And I really deeply believe in what could benefit Judaism and Jewish tradition and the Jewish people and the world beyond the Jewish people by the intersection of the generation that's kind of coming up right now and will come into leadership spaces in the years to come, and what we will contribute as part of our link in this chain that we talk about in our prayers and that we talk about as our blessing of having been a part of this people. So I think for me, I went to rabbinical school and I have spent a lot of time working in established Jewish community because I really don't want the work to be looked at as temporary or a band-aid to move from one stage of life to another. I actually believe that the Judaism that we are engaging with and the Judaism we are going to live is shifting in seismic ways. And I want to be one of those people that invites folks who are feeling that and sense that to lean into it and to explore the gifts that they can bring out of the tradition and into the world. So it means spending a lot of time having people tell me, oh, it's just a phase, or, oh, these are good ideas. But, I stand on the shoulders of those who taught me and those who encouraged me. And the strategy of how we embrace the fact that a new generation will come into leadership includes having rabbis and teachers who are willing to make the tradition accessible to those who hopefully will do it responsibly in ways that will link to many more generations to come.
What specifically are some of those seismic shifts that you're sensing from where you stand now?
Right. So I will tell people, and people know me sometimes as a champion of what I like to call the Mishkan movement. I have spent a lot of time in the last years thinking about the fact that what we are emerging from right now is a chapter in American Jewish life that I would refer to as Temple Judaism. And I am also referencing not just the temples and synagogues and shuls people may have belonged to as a way of communal connection and civic engagement, basically since World War II through the turn of the century. But I'm also referencing the temple that stood in Jerusalem many years ago that people would maybe go to 1 or 2 times a year, and then they would go home and, they might practice and observe in their own way. But it feels resonant to what I hear some folks say, which is maybe not this year, but, I go to shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and then I'll see you around when I see you, right? I think the Mishkan movement, which defined the method of community gathering when the Israelites were wandering in the desert and had to build a portable, movable, able to iterate space to convene with each other and the Holy One, but had to be packed up and moved every time they did, is very resonant with today. In my 20s, I made 5 moves of 3,000 miles or more, and my parents never moved out of Brooklyn and Queens until they married each other and moved in and built a house that they, grew my family in Virginia. So the mobility of young people, the technology and the way that we connect, and also the fact that resources that folks have, whether perceived or real, and in cases differently, are limited, means that folks are looking for the heart and soul of things more so than the structures that they might affiliate with. And I think those are changes that really challenge the way that American Jewish life has been built over the last 70 years and will fundamentally look different. But I also think about the fact that we have seen these plate tectonic shifts in how Jewish community is organized in other times in history. And those times in the moment have been really scary, but in the aftermath have given way to versions of Judaism that have become legacy ways of practicing. So I think those are some of the specifics and then some of the potentials of what will it mean moving forward, building a Judaism in a community that may look differently than the ones that we grew up in or that our parents associate as authentic for their experience.
So you said that these kinds of shifts have felt scary in the past. Is there any of it that feels scary to you, or do you have tactics to assuage those who look at this shifting and do feel very scared?
So it's all scary. But we're living in a pretty terrifying world. And at least since March, for me, I have been grateful every day that no matter how new agey or seemingly different or, countercultural my Jewish observance might be, I would be lying if I didn't say that prayer and text learning and connecting with people on deep levels in those spaces wasn't at the absolute foundation of how I've been moving through this time and able to get through what has been just series of difficult challenges. And I'm one of the lucky ones, I have tremendous amount of comforts, even in the discomfort of what we've been going through in these recent months and for all the reasons we have. I think for me, what scares me the most is that I also know that there's no guarantee. And I do spend a lot of time challenging things that have served really important purposes in sustaining Jewish peoplehood and in bringing together Jewish communities. And I have unapologetically encouraged us to consider doing things that may or may not yield the results we hope for. But for me, I am a person of faith, and I believe that, and when I root the way that I lead and the way that I teach and the way that I invite others to consider tapping in our time, that it's really informed by the heroes of mine that did this in other generations of Judaism. And I try to do it with authenticity, and I try to lead with humility, because I don't know, but I do know on an individual and a collective level, the way that my own engagement with these strategies and values have nourished and deepened my own life and living experience. And so, at the root of the awe we talk about having for the sacred is this notion of fear. So, and the same is true with building a board of diverse folks from different backgrounds, right? Like there is this idea that if you don't feel scared, then maybe you just aren't as deeply into where you need to be. So yeah, I'm terrified by all of it, but I feel like if there was not some element of fear there, it wouldn't have scratched the surface to the point where we have the potential to contribute in ways that might really be of great benefit in the long run.
When we were speaking just before we started recording, you mentioned something on a slightly different topic, but I think it applies here, which is approaching Judaism and the shifts and changes to come with an attitude of what gets added as opposed to giving something up. And I don't know, that's just resonating for me right now in a powerful way based on what you've said.
Well, perspective is everything, right? Like I'm not one to say there's a lot of God language that doesn't work for me. There's a lot of things about like my belief in some like source of all of this that even my own connection to it sometimes, I'm like, really, do I believe this? But so much of it is just a choice for a framework in which we want to live in. And learning this commentary on the Torah through a lens of Musar, which is kind of like Jewish character values. And I read an essay last week about the power of perspective. And especially during this time, it can be really easy to feel like you're operating constantly from a place of scarcity. There are a lot of things that are causing folks to feel stuck and narrow and maybe even hopeless at times. And we can't change a lot of what's going on around us, but we do have some element of power and control to consider the framework in which we want to enter into the world. And, I always say one of my favorite bits of Torah is the Torah of a conscious hip hop group out of the Bay Area called Black Alicious. And they have a line in one of their songs that says, you can wake up every day and you could say, good morning, God, or good God morning. And like that for me is so rich because it's like, boom, right there. Every day I can wake up and decide I am going to approach the world by having gratitude that I woke up to breathe this day in. And I can approach the world and think about the fact that I am tremendously privileged to wake up feeling like I can take a deep breath, because there are people that can't breathe because of systemic violence in systems. There are people that can't breathe because of fires burning in their towns and cities. And how lucky am I that I woke up today and I can breathe? And therefore, the responsibility I have to make my breath the most. And so, yeah, you have to figure out how to approach the world from a place of abundance rather than scarcity, because it's one of the best coping mechanisms for living in a world with so much uncertainty and scary things in it.
Right. Especially resonant moving into this high holiday season. At the point that we're recording this, it's not even quite Rosh Hashanah yet, although we're getting close. And by the time our listeners are hearing this conversation, we're going to be right up to Sukkot, which I think is an especially meaningful time for you.
I mean, Sukkot and Purim are my two favorite holidays, but then as soon as I say that, I feel like, oh, but all the other ones are too. For me, Sukkot is touching upon all of the themes that we have spent the last half an hour or so talking about in one week-long invitation to go outside and to feel, the potential of shifting seasons and the invitations that come with that. For me, it's about the welcoming of guests, both literally and metaphorically. It's about engaging on the precipice of a season in which hopefully we have received enough of what we need in order to get us through the uncertainty of the winter days. I think the reason that I love Sukkot the most is because it's one of the holidays that I believe strongly had agricultural imperative before it had theological overlay. And those are my favorite holidays because back to resonance and relevance. It's the season of communal rejoicing. I imagine that back in the days when the temple stood, that the experience of going to Jerusalem to bring your first fruits and to share in Zman Simchatenu, our season of joy, must have been similar to what it's like in those days when we could go to live concerts and I could be outside in the summertime going to see my favorite band Fish, and, you know, the picnics and the communal gathering that happens before you even enter into the sacred space in which the music happens. And it's reminder of the reality of impermanence, that everything we build for ourselves and everything that really kind of comes to light is not just by our own accomplishments or challenges alone. It has to do with the fertile ground or lack of fertile ground in which we've been kind of arbitrarily born into, right? I didn't choose to be born as a white Jewish girl who was the child of two New York Jewish parents, right? Like that was unearned for me, but I've spent my entire life building my identity on it. So yeah, and the building of the huts and the process of trying to erect something and putting so much love and attention into something that's ultimately going to go away a week later. I love everything about it. And I'm excited. I'm excited to think that this conversation is going to air just about the time that we're moving into that hut.
I know, and I love that framework that you just provided about the concerts. I'm not even a huge concert goer, but I just kind of put myself in that moment for just a brief second while you were talking, and was honestly so moved to just think about how that communing, whether it is for a Jewish holiday or whether it is like finding the sacred in those other kind of rituals that we have, is so palpable and emotional and moving, and how estranged we've been from it for these past 6 months.
But just to say, like, by like one last word, is for me, that's the like nafuhu, or the flipping on its head. That is also like why I would say Purim was my other favorite holiday, right? Like, I remember being at a fish show in Mexico, standing with a mentor and a dear friend of mine, and turning to her in the middle of this concert and saying, I think this is what it actually was like when we would make pilgrimage to the temple when it stood in Jerusalem. And then I'm like, oh, how much more can I try and understand this two-dimensional tradition I've inherited? Because I have this three-dimensional, completely not Jewish experience, although unless they cover Avinu Malkeinu, which they sometimes do, right? Like, and then all of a sudden the invitation to imagine something that would be hard to imagine without that experience that I can have in this life. That's like where it all is awesome and happens. And that friend and I are still talking about it, and I've since wrote a 40-page academic paper on it. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I'm glad that you got the good feels from imagining it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I let you go today, I would just love to give you the opportunity to either share something that I, didn't get a chance to ask you, or to elevate other people in this space who are doing work who you admire. It's kind of like a little free time for you to just kind of use as you'd like.
Oh my goodness. Well, I do feel so grateful to work for an organization and to work with colleagues every day that work to mobilize Jews and their communities to take action, to pursue a just world, to ignite a lifelong commitment to service, and to really believe that service is that supports social change is vital to a flourishing Jewish community and inspired Jewish life, but also has the potential to show up in the kind of partnership where we can have positive impact and we can do with others what we could never all do on our own. I feel like I need to shout out the tremendous leaders who are navigating this uncertain time by also taking full opportunity to show what's possible. And I think about my colleague Alana Kaufman and the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative and all of the leaders who they themselves, their leadership depends on them being vulnerable to be in spaces where they can be in service to the Jewish people in ways that will help us grow that much more. There are so many folks and so many initiatives that I think about, but when I think about the people who are really putting their own selves and bodies on the line to protest for the social changes that we need in order that all people, regardless of this color of their skin or their faith identity or their gender identity, are created in the image of the divine. And that work is happening in so many different places, and it's happening in increasingly scary territory. So those folks and anybody that's out there trying to encourage people to turn out to vote and to show up and to participate in their civic responsibility, which is also something that's incumbent upon us as Jews. I'm so grateful, and I'm in that work with you, and there will be so much more work to do, no matter which different moments we arrive at. So I think that's where I'll end it.
Thank you. And one last thing, what is just one thing making you happy right now?
I'm just happy my nephews make me happy. The little people in the world that I have the joy of living alongside and learning from, that I can't hug, and that it's so painful in that happiness, but just to see their resilience and to see their optimism and to see their curiosity, they make me happy every day, because they're ultimately going to be the ones that are going to take the lead of all of this, but their sense of soul and livelihood, even in a period of time where there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of hardship, the little people are making me happy every day. Their smiles and their laughter and their perseverance make me happy.
Amazing. Well, Rabbi, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so grateful to have your time and your wisdom and your expertise, and I also had a lot of fun, so thank you.
Me too. Thanks, Sara. It's so great to talk to you, and I hope we connect again soon.
Absolutely. Take care.
Leader Folk is all about elevating voices and starting conversations, so now we'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@tcjewfolk.com to share your thoughts, your ideas, or to nominate future guests. Leader Folk is a project of Jew Folk Inc. and the Jew Folk Podcast Network. For more information, visit tcjewfolk.com/podcast.